Right. Hey, everybody, thanks for being here. We're going to go ahead and get started. Um, just in case we haven't met, my name is Maddie Kohler, Program Director here at NASEO. I'm working on the home energy rebates and all things residential. So today we have an exciting presentation for you all. We're going to record it, just a heads up, and post it on the NASEO website so that folks can continue to reference it, and for people who aren't able to make the call today. But I saw a version of this presentation last month, and so very excited to share it with all of you as well on tenant engagement strategies, some really interesting like in-house, in-building engagement that folks are doing. So we've got one example in particular that we're going to spend an hour on today. In order to introduce it, I'm going to turn things over to Michael from the DC Energy Office to provide some background on this project and to introduce our presenter for today. So Michael, thanks for being here. Over to you for your remarks.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Maddie. Thanks everyone at NASEO for inviting Madeline to speak and for me to introduce the great work she's done. So let me pull up some slides just to have something to look at. Still there? Okay. Sorry, the presenter view always throws me. So let me just share my screen. Okay. Apologies for the raw view here, but um, thanks. Yeah, I'm just going to briefly introduce the Equitable Engagement Grant, Electrification Engagement Grant that I've been managing for DOEE over the past couple years. And also, it's going to be discussed in more detail by Madeline McCullough from the grantee entity we awarded, the National Housing Trust. And she's been the main point of the grant has been to grapple with what equity means with respect to building electrification, particularly how to engage impacted tenants equitably. Yeah, I'll give some context for the grant, where it came about, and then introduce some more details and Madeline. So DC has the goal to be the healthiest, greenest, most livable city in the country, which is very broad and leads to a number of different plans that we have, including Clean Energy DC, which looks at the biggest user or producer of emissions in DC, which, since we don't have any other industry or really commercial buildings are our industry, that's where all the emissions tend to come from. So the slide shows roughly 3/4 of our GHGs come from buildings. And so it became really important for us to, as we're starting to think more concretely about electrification and electrification policy, how do we do that equitably? So in addition to the clean energy and climate goals, DC overall has commitments to equity. So district-wide, there's, I'll spell this out for when I send this later. There's the Office of Racial Equity that Mayor Bowser established a few years ago, which also supports the kind of ongoing work defining what equity means in the district and helping to support different agencies implement doing what's called racial equity impact assessments. And apologies for the live editing, but think of it like a chalkboard. So we district agencies and really council members are required to do um, much like a financial impact assessment, a racial equity impact assessment for new legislation. Um, and that has started to kind of make more intentional and meaningful the process of working towards racial equity in the district. Then at DOEE specifically, we have a volunteer equity committee, um, which has helped develop a racial equity action plan, um, which includes, among other things, requiring every branch or division within DOEE to do ongoing racial equity impact assessments on their programs. And um, it's still a bit in a pilot phase right now, but we are committed to examining all the work we do through a racial equity lens. And I won't go through this, but this will be in the slides that I can share with Maddie to send around, just our definitions of equity. But essentially in DC, racial equity is the key piece in DC, because it's one of the main indicators of inequitable outcomes in DC. So we lead with race in this sort of examination, but we don't end there. And again, just more level setting, when we talk about equity, we're really talking about who is the most impacted with the least power to do anything about it. So the grant that Madeline's been working on with us, the goals in the RFA that we put out to eventually award to the National Housing Trust include learning from residents what a fair carbon neutral future looks like to them, learning what support they need to get there, and practice engaging equitably with residents to gather this information. And one of the main takeaways I want to put out there as kind of to preface Madeline's discussion is that, this was all a pilot effort, and it was also very intentionally open-ended. And so thinking about how to replicate this effort toward your own jurisdiction or state's needs, or even as we're thinking about making it kind of more specific. Some of the details will change, whether you're doing more of an open-ended outreach like this or more specific. But overall, the process should still be very enlightening and helpful to borrow from or build off of. And just more, there's a lot of this engaging with tenants in order to get to that point. There's a lot of grappling with like, what are we trying to say that Madeline will go into more. But really, we're grappling with equity with respect to building electrification, while also grappling with equity with respect to community engagement. How do we get residents a seat at the table? And how do we build the infrastructure for them to stay in the loop? So NHT's role has been to help develop an electrification and engagement plan and co-facilitate community engagement and put together a summary of findings and recommended actions. And I think I'll just kind of lay out the specifics, since this is for state energy offices. The award amount in total is $118,000 that we are funding through fees on development that go into a green building fund that we can do grant making with. And there's some additional funding that was procured through NRDC to help support community-based organization involvement in the effort. And the grant will be wrapping up at the end of this month. So with that, I will stop sharing, and I can pass it to Madeline McCullough, who has really been doing the vast majority of the legwork on this grant, and I'm very appreciative that she's here to talk about it.
Thanks, Michael, and good afternoon or good morning, everyone. I also have some slides I'm gonna quickly pull up. If you all can see those okay. Okay, cool. So my name is Madeline McCullough. I work at the National Housing Trust, or NHT, as our Sustainability Policy Team's Program Coordinator and Analyst. NHT is a public policy advocate and affordable housing provider based in Washington, D.C. We're a nonprofit. We bring together policy, lending, energy solutions, real estate development, and resident services under one roof to reduce economic disparities, advance racial equity, and strengthen community resiliency, both through policy and practice. And as Michael shared, one of the ways we're doing that is through the engagement pilot project with DOEE. So this is just a quick overview of kind of where I'll be focusing today's conversation on. So I'll first share kind of a walkthrough of our case study, our community engagement work we've been doing in the district, highlight some of the findings from our engagement, then walk through just like a step-by-step guide as to how the energy offices might be able to replicate community engagement to help shape your home energy rebates. And I'll emphasize what Michael shared is that, this is like, open-ended, kind of focusing on how to best engage residents around the conversation of electrification, and realizing that DC works differently than a lot of other states in the country. So this is meant to be a model that's, almost vague enough that it can be replicated for each state and for your specific state's needs as it relates to the home energy rebates program, but hopefully detailed enough that it gives you a good idea as a starting point. And then also just talk through some key considerations might be helpful as you're exploring community engagement in your state. So as Michael shared, the project we worked on was the Equitable Electrification and Community Engagement Pilot Program. And this was really rooted in understanding what are the resident concerns and priorities and questions as it relates to electrification and what that means to their communities. So some of the more immediate objectives or goals of our pilot were to first understand residents' concerns and daily challenges and how these concerns and challenges might be affected by an electrification transition. We also wanted to understand and share information with them about electrification and decarbonization and what it means specifically for them and for their community. We wanted to share actionable feedback to DOEE based on the conversations we had with communities to help inform policy decisions. And we had a goal of engaging with trusted community members to help support and lead resident engagement. Some of the more long-term objectives were supporting DOEE and understanding community engagement challenges and best practices in the hopes that this would be something they continue doing and they're operationalizing this in the district, as well as build long-term relationships between DOEE, the trusted community members that we're working with, and residents from these under-resourced communities to support ongoing engagement to inform policy development beyond just electrification policies as it relates to the Clean Energy DC 2.0 plan. So NHT and DOEE initially launched the pilot at 2 NHT-owned DC properties last summer. At the end of 2023, we received additional funding from DOEE to launch the pilot at a third property this May, this time focusing on a non-NHT-owned property to help get a better understanding of how the department can replicate community engagement and continue community engagement in places where they might not have existing relationships. So the first NHT property that we launched our pilot at was the Copeland Manor. It's a 61-unit limited equity cooperative in the Marshall Heights neighborhood of Southeast DC. The second property we selected was Monsignor Meadow, a 63-unit LIHTC property home to predominantly Spanish-speaking residents in Northwest DC. And the third property that we selected, which was the non-NHT-owned property, was Edward Commons. It's an Enterprise Communities property in Northeast DC. It's another LIHTC property with about 11 residential buildings, but we focused on 3 senior buildings located at the property. So once we selected the properties, we scheduled an on-site event called Power on the Block. Sorry, my computer's being a little slow. At each property, and Power on the Block events were scheduled on a weekday evenings, and they lasted about 2 to 3 hours. Going into this event, we knew that residents wouldn't want to spend their evening talking about electrification. And since Power on the Block served as kind of our first opportunity to engage with residents and introduce the pilot to the community, We wanted to ensure that this was a really fun event that helped us reach as many residents as possible. So we designed Power on the Block to virtually be a summer block party. We worked with the community's on-site resident services coordinators to invite existing community partners who provide a number of programs and services to residents in the communities like food security, digital literacy. We invited the public library. We distributed back to school supplies at the events that were hosted last summer. And local utility providers and DOEE also helped residents sign up for utility assistance programs and Solar for All, which is DC's community solar program that provides discount for low-income residents' electricity bills. We also had a DJ, a photo booth, there was a food truck. We ordered food from local restaurants in certain neighborhoods. At Copeland and Montenegro Meadow, we had a electrification themed scavenger hunt, which encouraged residents to identify environmentally themed objects around the property, like Copeland's on-site solar panels, LED lighting, some things like that, just to get them more familiar with the topic. And the project team also had a table at the Power on the Block events as a way to kind of introduce ourselves to the communities, to chat with residents, and just kind of at a high level introduce them to the pilot and the topic of electrification. Residents were also invited to fill out small group discussion interest forms, which we scheduled a few weeks after each Power on the Block event. And we framed these discussions as an opportunity for residents to provide feedback on DOEE's climate plans, which would include electrification measures, to help ensure that whatever policies and programs that were implemented delivered equitable benefits for all district residents. So we hosted 2 small group discussions at each property, and each discussion was scheduled for 90 minutes. And between 12 and 18 residents attended each discussion. These discussions were really focused on understanding residents' lived experiences and how they might be affected by electrification policies. So these are a list of questions from our small group discussion agenda that our facilitators referenced. I'll talk more about the facilitators in a moment. We wanted to make sure that these conversations were grounded in the lived experiences of the residents in the room. So after introductions and an icebreaker activity, we asked residents to share how they've been impacted by climate change. So we talked a lot about the Canadian wildfire smoke that hit the district last summer, the extreme heat waves we've been experiencing, increased storms and flooding. We also asked residents to share how their health has been impacted by these weather events and how certain conditions such as asthma or other chronic illnesses may be further triggered or worsened by climate change. We also wanted to understand how residents might be impacted in their home by climate change. So with the extreme heat waves that DC has been hit with the last few summers, residents shared that their utility bills have been very expensive in the summer because their cooling systems are having to work overtime, or there's issues with insulation and air sealing in their building that's just making it hard to keep their home cool in the summer and warm in the winter. So after we had a better understanding of some of the concerns and the challenges that residents are facing in their homes and in their community, we introduced DOEE's climate goals and their efforts to decarbonize and electrify the district. And we centered these policies in a way that can be used to address some of the concerns that residents were raising earlier in the evening. And we asked them to share their honest thoughts on what policies like these would mean for them. We talked through what electrification would look like in their home, what it would mean for their utility bills, and what they thought the benefits and challenges would be as a result. We also asked residents to share what they expected from DOEE throughout this process, from educating residents about electrification to timeline for when they can expect to electrify their homes to the policy and program rollout specific details. So through these conversations, we identified some pretty common themes that were consistent across all 6 small group discussions at the 3 properties that we worked at. So during every discussion, when we began talking about electrification and walking through what this would look like in their home, and we shared that it typically involves switching out a gas stove for an electric one. A lot of residents were very quick to tell us that they would not be giving up their gas stoves. For the Black and the Latinx communities, gas cooking has a really important role in how certain food is traditionally prepared. And some residents who have used electric stoves shared that in the past, it just doesn't cook food the same way. But as we began kind of talking through the toxins that gas stoves release when they're being used, and residents shared some scary stories about gas stoves being left on when no one was home, and then their building had to be evacuated by the fire department, or they had their children or grandchildren running around the kitchen and they bumped into the stove and accidentally turned the gas on. We saw shifts in how residents began to think about electrification and what this would mean for them. And by the end of each discussion, health and safety concerns became a really big factor in residents either supporting or being open to DOEE's electrification policies. Another key concern that residents raised was an increase in utility costs after electrification, which is completely valid. These are low-income residents, many of which are on fixed incomes, and they can't afford a higher electric bill. So this was an issue that residents really wanted DOEE to account for in their program and policy design. Residents also wanted to see DOEE continue to lead community engagement and education efforts. They advocated for ongoing community input opportunities and for DOEE to be more present in communities. One resident suggested that DOEE should furnish out like a van that they can drive around the district and help get the word out about DOEE's initiatives in addition to just electrification. But residents also shared that it would be helpful to have resources or meetings where they can learn how to properly use electric stoves, especially for residents that have only ever had gas stoves in their home and have concerns about the difference in the quality of how food is cooked. But most important for residents across all the small group discussions we had was the importance of centering equity through the electrification program and policy, both their design and their implementation process. These residents were very adamant that they want to make sure that if they are being forced to go through the electrification process, even if it's not something they really want to go through, that they're getting the same quality appliances as wealthier and wider neighborhoods in the district are receiving, and that they're also receiving these upgrades at the same time as these wealthier and wider neighborhoods, and not receiving these upgrades years later when there's less people on the gas system and the prices are much higher. So these findings and NHT's recommendations have been shared with DOEE and are being used to help shape policies in the district that are currently being drafted or finalized, like the Clean Energy DC 2.0 plan. But there are ways that this community model can be replicated in other states and jurisdictions like the ones you all work in. I'll note that while our model of engagement isn't revolutionary and it's not very complex, it does require that whoever is leading the engagement to be intentional and thoughtful about the end goal of this work. So as you're launching your home energy rebate programs, you want to make sure you're engaging communities that are going to be impacted the most by these programs. So while the step-by-step guide I'll share in a moment is designed to help get you started, it is flexible enough to account for the varying needs and priorities across each state. And I do encourage you all to think about how you can operationalize community engagement beyond just the requirements and Department of Energy has. So how can stakeholder engagement help shape other programs you're designing or implementing in your state? This is something we've been having conversations with DOEE about. And we've heard from their staff that who were involved in this pilot project that they now have a changed perspective on how their work impacts district residents, and that they feel more invested in these communities, and they want to have these communities involved in more policy design and program design. So that's just something, to be mindful of. The programs you administer are directly impacting communities and the residents who live there, and we want to make sure that we're taking advantage of the historical opportunities the IRA provides, and ensuring that the end results are equitably benefiting the communities most in need of electrification measures, decarbonization, the communities most impacted by climate change who contribute the least to what's causing climate change. So just a quick 5-step guide that can be replicated to help guide community engagement for the home energy rebate programs would be step 1 is identifying who your target stakeholders are. So a key component of our project was engaging with low-income residents. But when we are assessing NHT's portfolio which is all low-income housing, we wanted to make sure that we were selecting properties that were most appropriate for the pilot. So we looked at the subsidy type of the properties. Low-income communities disproportionately bear the brunt of climate change. So we targeted communities with specific income restrictions, the LIHTC properties that we worked with, and the majority of these residents that were engaged are at or below 50% AMI. We also looked at the racial composition of the residents. In the district, low-income communities are predominantly made up of Black and Brown residents. So we wanted to make sure that the communities we engaged with reflected that. We also looked at the building energy profile and if there are opportunities to decarbonize and increase the property's resiliency. Since these conversations had to be rooted in residents' lived experiences, we wanted to make sure we were talking with residents who would actually be impacted by electrification policies. So meaning they lived in units that had gas appliances and systems currently. So at all three properties, Copeland Manor and Monsignor Meadow, both buildings have in-unit gas appliances and equipment. And at the three buildings we targeted at Edgewood Commons, they're all going through different phases of the electrification process. One still has gas appliances, one is fully electric, and one is currently going through a retrofit process that includes electrification measures. And we also looked at properties that had an active tenant association. This was kind of a selfish pick for us. It made resident engagement at the beginning a bit more easier. We had a group of residents that we knew were engaged and could help us engage their neighbors in the project. So for the purpose of a home energy rebate program, some of the things you consider is, who are the eligible households that you're targeting for these programs. DOE requires 40% of funds be allocated to low-income households. So you want to make sure you're definitely engaging with households that are at or below 80% AMI. If you're targeting her to multifamily and here to single family, make sure you're working with buildings that reflect those program targets. The second step is identifying your key partners. So this pilot only came about because DOEE knew they needed to have community input in their electrification plan and the Clean Energy DC 2.0 plan. But they also knew they couldn't facilitate this engagement on their own, which led to NHT being selected to administer the pilot. But we also knew that we needed partners to help make sure this was the most impactful program. And since we didn't have experience leading small group discussions and engaging residents in conversations about electrification, we identified two CBOs who were subcontracted to help lead this engagement at the three properties. So at Copeland and Edgewood, we worked with a woman named Robin Lewis, whose background is working with the Black Church and other faith-based organizations on how they can improve the energy efficiency and electrify their churches and their buildings. And at Monsignor Meadow, we worked with Eco Latinos. They're a DMV organization who focuses on environmental justice issues and how those issues impact the Latinx community. This also meant that by working with them, we didn't have to have a translator come in for the small group discussions at Monsignor Meadow. We were able to offer everything completely in Spanish, so it really encouraged participation among the residents. They didn't have to worry about any language barriers in the room. We made sure that DOEE staff president also spoke Spanish, and folks from NHT who were there spoke Spanish as well. We also worked closely with the on-site property management and resident services staff to help design Power in the Block and coordinate with scheduling events that were going to be hosted on-site. On-site staff also helped us identify resident engagement leaders who were individuals from the community who served as a liaison between the community, residents, and the project team. RELs helped us plan events. They attended small group discussions and provided a resident perspective during post-discussion debrief meetings where we finalized our findings and recommendations to DOEE. RELs also played a key role in creating that initial level of trust that we had to have with the community before we could actually begin to host small group discussions. And they helped encourage their neighbors to participate in Power in the Block and sign up for small group discussions as well. So for home energy rebates, the key partners that you all could be working with us, the energy offices, could also be CBOs, community-based organizations in different communities across your state. It could be public housing authorities. It could be your state's housing finance agency to help connect you with multifamily affordable housing providers who you want to benefit from these rebate programs, tenant advocacy groups, local government agencies. The list goes on and on. But number three, step three is outreach to your target stakeholders. This can be as high touch or as in-depth as you need it to be for your level of community engagement. Leading up to Power in the Block, we door knocked and passed out flyers to each home. And then leading up to small group discussions, we sent out texts, phone calls, emails to residents reminding them that the event was coming up and, to make sure that they attended. But other outreach strategies could be newsletters, posting information around community centers, public transportation and schools, post offices. Again, very long list of places that you can conduct outreach to get residents to show up to engagement opportunities. Step four is conducting your stakeholder engagement. So based on where you're at in your rebate program design and implementation process, this engagement can be designed to help inform a number of things, such as, what measures may be covered by rebates. When we went into the small group discussions, we thought we'd be talking a lot about stoves and switching out gas stoves for electric stoves. But through these conversations, we learned that there is a big need for improved building envelope in buildings. So DOEE now has information that they can take back to help inform the HERB program and the building envelope or weatherization eligible measures through the HERE program that maybe otherwise they wouldn't have looked at so closely. This can also be determining what kind of technical assistance you might need to provide to building and homeowners to, collect the data they need to have to show that 20% energy savings, to understand what these measures are supposed to be doing in their buildings and in their homes. And then also any exceptions or caveats that you might need to consider for your state's program, whether it's for multifamily or single family participation. And then finally, and very important for our project, was following up with your stakeholders. So depending on how you're approaching community engagement, either as a way to collect feedback on how to design your program or to share what your plan is or what you've designed your program to do, you really want to make sure that you're actively doing something with the input you get from stakeholders through community engagement. So there should be follow-up with stakeholders once your program's launched, support to make sure that these building owners and homeowners are taking advantage of the program, seeing if they have any questions or barriers to participation. And they should also be able to see where their input was incorporated into the final program. So for DOEE, it's that really important level of equity that's being included into the Clean Energy DC 2.0 plan. They're beginning the process of the rebate community engagement, but residents should be able to know that we voiced X, Y, and Z, and our state energy office made sure that those barriers wouldn't be present in the final program rollout. But it's also important that for continued ongoing community engagement, that you're having that follow-up, because without it, it could lead to mistrust with government or with whoever's leading the community engagement. If residents talked to you last year and they didn't see what happened with that input, making sure that your continued presence in communities will help for increased engagement in the future. And then in addition to those steps, there's just a few things that we've reflected on as a team on some key issues that, in future engagement, we want to make sure are being considered. The first is making sure that you're aware of who you're actually engaging with. So if you're targeting BIPOC communities, it's important to make sure that agency staff or the partners you're working with are reflective of the communities you're engaging. We made sure we're working with Black and Latinx communities, that our facilitators, the team who was present, that they reflected and they were able to connect with those residents. This helps them makes them feel more comfortable, and it can also help avoid some barriers to engagement that an entire white team going into a Latinx community might present. And some additional barriers to engagement that you should be mindful of is community mistrust with government. We are working in communities that have historically been let down or harmed by district government. So it was important that we address that history and DOEE's intentions with the pilot. We went back and forth on whether DOEE should participate in small group discussions and be present in those rooms. We didn't want DOEE's presence to mean residents couldn't speak freely or voice their concerns, but we also wanted to make sure that they knew that their opinions and their input was important. And so by having DOEE ultimately attend those small group discussions, residents were able to direct their questions, their concerns directly to Michael and his team. A lot of the time they stayed back and talked with DOEE staff about completely unrelated things, but it's because they wanted to talk with them while they were in the room. So I think residents were very appreciative of having DOEE staff present during these small group discussions. We also compensated residents for participating in this pilot. So each resident that attended a small group discussion received a $100 gift card, and there was a stipend for the REL since they were contributing about 10 hours a month for 3 to 5 months with us. And our CBO partners also received compensation for their time. We realize this is not something that can be replicated in every community engagement effort, but compensation in some way is important, whether it's providing food, making sure that there's resources and programs available for residents who are attending, something that they can take home with them outside of just providing input. And then also location was really important. So rather than having residents come to us, come to the DOEE office, come to the NHT office or some third-party location, we made sure that we are going to residents directly. We wanted to make sure that we were present in their community, that they saw us in their community, and this also allowed for increased participation since residents didn't have to worry about traveling or dealing with childcare, things like that. That could have been a barrier to engagement. So that was just a high-level guide as to how potentially community engagement could be replicated for states as you're all designing your home energy rebate program. NHT really wants to make sure that the home energy rebate program benefit low-income households, especially multifamily low-income households. And we're always happy to chat more about the work we did with DOEE and answer any questions that folks may have. I think I'm a little under time, but that is all I have for today. So I'll go ahead and stop sharing.
Thank you. Always okay to be a little under time. I want to take this opportunity first to say thank you. We'll turn now to questions and Q&A. That's how we'll spend the remainder of the time today. So if anyone in the audience has a question, please drop it in the chat or use your raise your hand feature and we'll call on you. While folks are considering their questions, there's something I wanted to follow up on. And I think it gets maybe to your point about having DC representation in the rooms, which is when folks voice concerns about electrification measures, take utility bills, for example, was it somebody in the room's job to sort of talk about ways to mitigate that, or were you just there to listen and absorb?
So I guess like a mix of both. Like in some cases we were like, oh, that's totally a valid point. It's something that, you know, DOE is mindful of. But we also then asked residents, are you participating in the LIHEAP program? Have you enrolled in Solar for All? In some cases that was, oh, I have no idea this was a program, so we shared resources later. But in some cases it was, you know, residents just weren't eligible for that program. So it's a bit of mix of both. I don't know, Michael, if you have anything to add.
Yeah, just adding to that, I think, again, like specific to this outreach, it was intentionally open-ended and like kind of like figuring out what we don't know and as a starting point. And so the main point was to listen to concerns so that we can take those back and think about, okay, how do we account for those concerns and how do we answer them? So for this sort of broad engagement around like what does a fair path to electrification look like for residents, we tried to leave those questions more open-ended or answer them where we had information. But the key is that like now as we go into something like the IRA rebate program implementation, we know like we need to have an answer for that question, which like is a little bit obvious, but also like we've heard the questions, we have something to kind of like focus on, that we really need a way to answer that question when we do more specific like action-oriented engagement around that program. So.
Thanks for that. So we've got a question in the chat, and I'll just read it out so everybody, in case you don't have eyes on the chat, which is, how did you address potential operational cost increases with electrification?
Yeah, similar. So kind of similar to what you're asking before, Maddie. But I think for now, we were honest and just said like we don't know, and that our goal is for operational costs to decrease through it, and that some existing programs that help in the event that operational costs do increase, that DC has include our Solar for All program, which gives enrolled residents discount on their utility bills. We also, there's a utility discount program that's separate. So we tried to kind of flag things that the tools that we have that we're looking at preliminarily. But again, like as we get into more like specific engagement around like this work is you know being planned at your property, we want to have more specific answers of like this is what we expect, these are in terms of like cost increases, if and I think part of that is also planning to follow up. So not just engaging up front, being like, this is what's coming. We also have work scoped for all the rebate work to follow up, a few months, 6 months after the work is complete to check in on how it's going. And I think we'll see kind of how our, the projected operational cost changes will compare to reality for residents, and like work with them on either, is there something not working right with the equipment they received? Is there something they could be doing to operate them better? Are there programs available to them that they could sign up for? So that's, yeah, the long answer. The short answer is we're still working on like a more specific answer to that, and hope to have that as we get into implementation.
Thanks. We've got another question in the chat, which is, did NHG see great success, by which they mean enrollment, from the events or meeting with the residents during the small group discussions? I think they're asking if people are enrolling in electrification programs, but Audrey, feel free to come off mute and correct me if I'm not understanding your question correctly.
No, it's correct. So essentially, I just wanted to see like if there was any data points to see if there was greater success with the in-person Power on the Blocks events or in the small group discussions, and see how the residents were receptive of it. Did they prefer like the more fun events? And then how often were those events thrown?
Yeah, so Far on the Block was just like a one-time thing in the summer, or this May at Edgewood Commons. And that event was more of like the block party where there's food and music and residents kind of just hang out and talk to the different providers and service providers and program facilitators that already work at the property or partner with resident services there. And it was meant to just like kind of like a high touch introduction to the project. So we kind of like at a very high level mentioned electrification and DOEE's pilot project. And then we shared that, we're going to be having these small group discussions in a few weeks, where you all can share more feedback on DOEE's electrification policies. And if you attend, you get a gift card for joining and for sharing your thoughts. Both events were really well attended. But one issue that we did see, and they kind of had different goals, but with the small group discussions, was we would have the first event and we would have, about 12 residents attend, which was what our target goal was 12 residents a session. And then when it came time for the second session at that property, they had told their neighbors that they got $100 for going to this meeting. And so more residents tried to attend the second one. And we had to kind of, navigate making sure it was a small group discussion, but also making sure that residents were able to participate. But overall, we had good attendance at both events. Residents want there to be continued opportunities to provide feedback at the property. Residents also are excited for opportunities where they can receive gift cards for participating in things. So, they like to have those. But it was just one Power on the Block and then 2 small group discussions at each property.
Okay, thank you.
Another question I have is for like the program design questions. I'm curious if you can reflect on the similarities and differences between the buildings where you conducted these meetings, and if you think that a building by building approach, is touching as many as you can is necessary, or if there's like some kind of tipping point wherever you reach, X number of buildings, you feel like you have a good representation of what people in DC think about these programs.
It's a great question. I think so. I think they're both. You need to do both. Which I mean, again, it's hard to translate directly because DC is a city and a state, and geographically very small and dense. But I think from our perspective, like figuring out a kind of like an engagement strategy was really useful. And then that strategy is pretty adaptable to go in either direction of like broad building by building engagement to inform policies. And also like that can be scaled down to implementing policies. So I feel like I'm getting off of what you asked, but yeah, I mean, I don't think we definitely don't have enough data points right now at 3 buildings. We're figuring out how can we fund additional like open-ended engagement to form more like broader understanding of impacted residents perspective on electrification. I think the like pretty remarkable consistency across the responses from the properties, which I like, you would agree, Madeline, right? That like the responses were like pretty consistent from property to property, was encouraging to think of to help us think like it's not like we aren't any closer to understanding more about what residents are concerned about, but so we have some information to begin working on, but yeah, there's more work to be done. And I think from a resource perspective, we probably are gonna be looking at more just like broad across different wards of the city approaches for engagement rather than like community by community, but practicing that community level or property level engagement is helpful because we'll be able to replicate that for like very specific work at specific properties. Does that make sense? Okay.
Thanks.
Yeah.
All right, any other questions or comments from the group? Like I said, feel free to put it in the chat, but you also can just raise your hand if you'd prefer to do that. And while folks are thinking, I'll do sort of like closing thoughts, closing reminders, which is if Madeline and Michael are willing, we can definitely share the slide deck with everybody, and we'll share the slide deck and the recording on the NASEO website, like I said before, so that folks can reference this later. Really appreciate the step-by-steps, Madeline. Always good to sort of like have an outline that people can reference and sort of like check their progress against. But I'm not seeing any hands or any folks adding to the chat, so I think we'll go ahead and wrap things up early. Michael just added his email in the chat if folks want to follow up with him directly. I'm also happy to make connections for anyone that's interested. But Madeline, Michael, thank you so much for sharing your experience with this grant program. Really appreciate you taking the time to be here this afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Great. Have a great rest of your afternoon, everybody.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.